Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a program for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes, or to suggest a particular topic or guest you would like to hear featured on the program. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. This is the final episode of Season 2 of the Global Missions Podcast, and we are so thankful for all of our faithful listeners. Over the next few weeks, we'll be rebroadcasting 4 popular episodes from Season 2. We hope you'll enjoy these encore presentations, and we will be resuming with new episodes in September. Our guest today is Paul Borthwick, an author and teacher who is well qualified to help us understand the changing role of the North American Church in global missions. We're thinking together about the 21st century. Our world is changing, and this conversation is really packed with some important ideas for thinking through how we can continue from North America to participate fruitfully and graciously. Before we get to the interview today, we'd like to share with you this missions resource.
OMF is a global fellowship of Christians with a heart for East Asia. We pioneer life-changing ministries. We partner with like-minded churches and agencies. We pray and persevere in difficult places. To learn more about how you can join in God's work among East Asians, visit us at omf.org. OMF, Heart for Asia, Hope for Billions. And now, here's today's interview.
Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's interview on the Global Missions Podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Paul Borthwick, who, together with his wife, Christy, serves on the staff of Development Associates International, DAI International, and focuses on leadership development in the majority world. He has been a prof at Gordon Conwell in the past. Paul, we want to say welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mags.
Paul is an author and has helped many of those in the missions world with several books. I remember, Paul, meeting you once in an elevator and trying to relay some thanks because you write a book. I know you write material and you send it out there. Some of us are reading it and using it and very much appreciating it. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad somebody's reading my stuff.
There are a few books on my shelf. Great Commission, Great Compassion, Following Jesus and Loving the World. More recent book. And then I have one that I'm going to mention. It's called A Mind for Missions. Mm-hmm. If you can imagine, Paul, that was back in 87 is the print date in my copy. 10 ways to build your world vision. And there are some great lasting ideas in this book as well, published by the Navs back in the day.
Ranging from biblical foundations to buy a world map shower curtain so you're praying for the world at least a couple of times a day.
You know, that's a fantastic idea. I don't know whether George Verwer did that or not. Did he make it into his jacket or?
Who knows? Who knows?
Great ideas about how we can be mindful of a world that goes beyond our own borders. Today, we've asked Paul to unpack with us one of his more recent publications entitled Western Christians in Global Mission. What's the role of the North American Church? Paul, this is about 5 years old, this book, but as I prepared for today's discussion, it really feels very relevant still to many ongoing discussions.
Well, it's probably, of all the things that I've done, which are more on the popular, how to help people get interested in global missions range, this one is the closest to being something that actually relates to missiology, although I've been told it's a quick read, meaning it's pretty understandable, but it's probably the most important book that I'll ever write.
It is a very accessible book. I'll just say to our listeners, it's very readable. And what we're going to try to do today is very ambitious. It's packed with great ideas, and we'll only be able to access part of it, but we hope you'll be encouraged by it and you'll find it helpful. Just as we get going, would you take just a minute, please, and tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be passionate about God's mission?
I was born into a Christian family, and so we did have missionaries visit our house when I was a young kid. I can remember vacation Bible school with missionary themes. But if I look at my own life now, I think objectively, the biblical teaching on the Great Commission combined with just facts learned about the world through things like perspectives and other things, that provided an objective foundation. And then short-term missions and relationships with global Christians has really subjectively just made me want to be part of what God's doing in the world.
I noted in one of your books, and I don't remember which one it is, but you included a list of some of your newer friends' names. And I say newer, they may be longtime friends by now, but they're not North American names. It was a long list of this wonderful mix of non-North American friends that you have.
Yes, and some of those names took me 2 or 3 years to know how to pronounce correctly.
I'm sure. It's just very rich. And we appreciate you sharing that both through the book and through this conversation. For the last several hundred years, or at least a couple hundred years, the North American church has been one of the principal senders and supporters of missionaries. Talk with us a little bit about how that trend is changing these days.
Somewhere in the 1980s, I was told that statisticians came to the realization that the global church was now more than 50% in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And along the lines of the Great Commission, Matthew 28, the church around the world was getting the realization that that commission was for them. And so as a result, you have Nigerians going to Brazil, Brazilians going to Angola, Angolans going to North Africa, North Africans coming to Toronto. And we are living in an age where, from a North American perspective, we now have a much wider team that we're part of. So it's from every nation to every nation. And correspondingly, the Western world, so North America as well as Western Europe, Australia, is also now a huge recipient of missionaries. So we're no longer just a sender, but also a receiver through both international students as well as immigrants as well as refugees. And it's an amazing time. I love to tell people that outside of the time that Jesus walked the earth, I think this is the most exciting time to be alive in Christian history.
Wow. Do you think that we as a church in North America are understanding this trend?
It depends a lot on the church, on the pastor, on the leadership. I think many times when I go to visit or speak at churches, their mission vision seems to be somewhere stuck in the 1980s or 90s. It's still a from us to them. It's still a largely European-descended people, white people going to other countries. And we really haven't grasped the fact that there's a Nigerian church denomination that has planted 500 churches in North America.
Wow.
And they're sending missionaries to all these places. I was in Ghana with leaders whose denomination has missionaries. It's a Ghanaian denomination, and they have missionaries in 70 countries.
Isn't that marvelous? Wow. I just wonder sometimes, and I'm perhaps guilty of it myself too, sitting here in the West thinking we got to figure this out and we need to make sure that we take the gospel to the ends of the earth. And what I'm hearing you say is, while there still may be a part for the North American church to play, it's certainly not all about us getting the message out there.
It's not all about us. And actually, in terms of a paradigm shift, one of the most significant things that's happened is a lot of the history of missions, British, European, North American, was from wealthier, more powerful, if I could use that in quotes, nations to less powerful, less wealthy. Now you have some of that inverted. So people coming from what used to be considered developing or non-Western countries that are not as wealthy, sending missionaries to Europe and North America. It's just a grand shift of God at work, surprising us with who's taken the gospel where.
So in this context then, where God is obviously at work and sending as many or maybe more mission workers from the majority world as from the Western world, the whole topic here is, how then do we participate then? How should the North American church continue to participate in this? What are some of the strengths that we can still bring as the North American church? What can we contribute?
When I was doing the research for this book you're referring to, Western Christians in Global Mission, I asked global leaders that very question.
Mm-hmm.
What does the North American church bring? What are some of our weaknesses? And then we also evaluate the other way, what's the strengths and weaknesses of the majority world church?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the answers that came most frequently, obviously, was generosity. We have financially more resources. We oftentimes have more educational resources. One humorous but sort of insightful statement was that the North American church, especially those of us in the United States, bring with us a naive optimism, meaning a belief that change is possible, which actually is sometimes very helpful in countries that are stuck in the past more than anticipating the future. We also have some experience, cross-cultural experience, lessons learned as missionaries that can help the new missionary centers, the Brazilians, the Nigerians, the Indians, the Singaporeans, the people going now out as missionaries. We can help them keep from making the same mistakes as we made.
Sure. If they'll make their own mistakes, but they might as well not make the same ones we have.
Absolutely.
Well, those are some of the strengths that we bring, the assets, if you will. What are some of the concerns or negative elements that we need to be careful of?
Well, there's a host of them. And again, it may apply less or more depending on the churches and the context we're in North America. But there's a tendency towards oversimplification of the world. We talk about all Muslims like they're one cohesive unit. Or we talk about some of the issues in the world today as if they can be solved with some sort of quick solution. It's oversimplification, misunderstanding of where we all fit together. So sometimes I hear churches sound like they need to do the whole Great Commission by themselves, and forgetting the fact that we're part of a huge multinational team. In our country, in the United States, right now at least, I think churches are being at least implicitly affected by a sort of an undercurrent of nationalism and a superiority towards the rest of the world that basically says America first and the rest of the people maybe. And then, a lack of critical thinking sometimes, and I think sometimes just a posture of superiority, which is founded on our consumerism, by which I mean we think that if we're richer, therefore we must be better. And I think that's a dangerous trend that we need to be very humbly aware of as we enter into global mission.
Well, in your book, you unpack some of the principles you submit will be helpful for North American churches to consider as they partner, and they want to be faithful, they want to be fruitful in partnering with the majority world church. What are some of those principles, Paul?
Well, the first one that I list, I think there's 5 of them in the book, and the first one is humility. The idea that we have as much to learn as we have to teach, the idea that we have to be giving as well as receiving, which leads to the second principle, which is reciprocity. It's amazing how many people in North American churches want to go fix global projects or go fix global situations, but we don't realize that that church in that country has something to offer us. Sadly, we go to their churches and they invite us to speak. They come to our churches and we invite them to talk for 90 seconds. And there's not a sense of reciprocity. The spirit of sacrifice, we pride ourselves in being generous, but if we're middle-class North Americans, we can be generous without being sacrificial. In other words, we can give away lots of money, but we still have lots left over. And I would advocate that one of the things that the global church wants from us is the willingness to walk with them, to be with them, to join them in the slums, to join them in the struggle, and take the risks that actually involves our lives and not just our money. The fourth principle that I cite in the book is that I think we need to, again, come back to this whole idea of equality, that it's the whole church taking the whole gospel to the whole world. And that means we are alongside of people who are equally called, equally competent, and equally desirous of effectiveness as we might be. Even if degrees, the amount of education might be different, they're the ones that we need to be joining alongside of. And last but not least, and it's a very difficult one for us as North Americans sometimes, is we need to be listening. I think that my wife came up with this little adage that with 2 ears and 2 eyes and 1 mouth, try to observe and listen 4 times for every word you speak. And I think sometimes we ask questions and simultaneously put the answer into the mouths of the people we're talking to, as opposed to just sitting and being silent to listen to what they actually have to say. When I was introducing the book in Colorado Springs, at the end of the session, there was a man from Papua New Guinea, PhD, one of the few Christian PhDs in that country. And he stood up and he said, "Are you telling me, white man," basically he said, "that you think you have something to learn from me?" And I said, "Absolutely, that's the whole message of the book." And the man, from a culture that's very expressive in terms of emotion, burst into tears. He said, "I have been working with white missionaries all my life, and this is the first time I've ever heard this." And I think that's a real profound image of what we need to work at in a most challenging way to basically learn from and be second to the global leaders that we're trying to serve.
Wow, what a great example, and a great piece of advice by Christy, too. I don't know if it's any encouragement to her, but I put a bookmark in that page of the book, 4-to-1 listening for speaking. Sometimes we just think, I think in the West, that we've got the answer, right? We think we're smart, we're educated. You've already touched on those things, but this is a different spirit to approach the whole conversation with.
Yeah, and Pastor Oscar Murillo from Nairobi Chapel, he's quoted quite a few times in the book. He basically said in one of his talks, "Please don't come to Africa thinking you're going to fix Africa. Come to Africa and join us in ministry, but don't come thinking you're going to fix us." Which I think is just a sort of a blunt way to say that's the way many times we go out.
Maybe just a sidelight here, Paul. How do majority world churches and majority world leaders generally perceive us from North America?
I think the only answer I could give to that is it depends. If you find missionaries that are truly there to serve, they love us, they welcome us, they make us their family. If you find people that still feel like they need to lord it over people by, having big budgets, then you find people who are in effect renting national partners, but not necessarily partnering with them. And I think the most significant trait is the capacity for mutuality. That we give and we take and we join together. Again, Pastor Oscar, he gave a great analogy at one of the Urbana Student Missionaries Conventions. He said, when North Americans think about partnership, they think about transactional partnerships. Let's come together and build a church. Let's come together and translate a scripture. Let's come together and do a project. He said Africans, and I would argue most of the relational world is this way, when they think of partnerships, they think in terms of family. And if we're family even if we're not doing anything together. It's just that we have a relationship that will last for our lifetime.
Wow, great wisdom and learning for us. Paul, I wonder if there are listeners to this podcast, they're part of a church, and that church really does want to do a good job, an improving job of being part of the global mission movement. What do you see as priorities for that church? What advice would you give to them?
Well, every church is going to have to realize at some point they can't do everything. So I think it's wise for churches to have some sort of policy or strategy. But the question I put to churches most often is, what is your first priority? Because if your first priority is to be strategic, then you might be able to invest a lot of money, few people, do something very, very strategic, like reach an unreached people group or do something in some remote part of the world. But chances are the vast majority of the congregation won't be involved in that or even understand it, partly because it might endanger the people doing it to make it loud in the congregation. So I really strongly encourage churches to make their first priority to missionize the congregation. And what I mean by that is to get people excited about God's world so that they know how to talk to the Muslim girl who works at the restaurant, so that they know how to start a conversation with their coworker who's dancing in the New Age, so that they know how to go on a short-term mission trip and actually learn from the experience of going to Haiti or Jamaica or someplace that might be cross-cultural to them. I really believe that from that point, God can direct people into his strategy if it starts with getting it into them, ranging from children to senior adults who can use a second career, but helping them see that God's global mission includes them.
Missionizing the congregation, great expression. What advice would you have for a church as far as practical steps then? They want to learn more about engaging the newer era of mission and genuine partnership. What steps might they take, Paul?
I think one thing is to look around yourselves as a church to what are the global opportunities in your own neighborhood. In other words, the changing demographics of our communities, the Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, the unreached, that a generation ago were exotic over their people. Now they're my pharmacist, my medical doctor, my next door neighbor, my coworker in the office, looking for local opportunities to learn how to do global mission. I think a second thing is churches are wise to connect to something bigger than themselves, whether it be mission agencies that have multicultural staff, or a group like IFES, the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, which is intervarsity basically around the world. I think that learning who some of the leaders are around the world can help us get connected to some leaders that we might not otherwise know just by virtue of our own churches.
Well, some very helpful ideas here. Remember that during these podcasts, we take show notes. And so we're going to capture all of these ideas that Paul is mentioning, including some of the links that might be helpful, and include those in the show notes as well. We're just scratching the surface on these topics, of course. Paul, I wonder if any of our listeners would like to follow you or learn more from you. How can they do that?
They can sign up for my blog at just my name, www.paulborthwick.com, which I do periodically, not so faithfully, but I try to do twice a month, which has random thoughts about random ideas. You can look up Development Associates International, which is www.daintl.org, and learn about what we're doing in partnership. All of the 18 or more countries we're working in are all led by indigenous leaders, and you can meet some of them if you'd like to through that website. I do encourage things like IFES World, which is the website of International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. Mission Exchange, there's a group that helps agencies connect with each other. Just different ways to get connected with a bigger world than ourselves.
Some super resources. We'll include those in the show notes. Just as we wind down, Paul, I'd like to just ask you, from the conclusion of your book, to speak to some of the analogies there you've used. This big dynamic of the West formerly having been, can I say primary, I say that respectfully and carefully, no longer necessarily the case. These analogies, how can we go forward in a healthy way?
Well, one of the analogies you'll hear is people saying, well, the baton has been passed.
Right.
And in the book, I just want to reiterate that I thoroughly disagree with that analogy. Mm-hmm. Because in a relay race, when the baton is passed, the person who releases the baton gets out of the race. And there is never a time that the North American church is released from involvement in God's Great Commission. Mm-hmm. We are always going to be in this race. Mm-hmm. I would argue, however, that there are going to be places where we need to be the initiators, and there are other places where we need to just take a step back and follow the lead of local leaders, indigenous leaders in different countries. Mm-hmm. But I think we're still in this gigantic, I called it in the book, a parade. We're just not necessarily at the front of the parade anymore. And are we humble enough to march in that parade, even if we're not the ones up front?
Well, we have the example in the scriptures of a body working together with different capacities. I appreciated your alluding to that as well, that we can serve with the capacities the Lord has given to us, but in a humble spirit, in a collaborative spirit, with wonderful sisters and brothers in Christ that the Lord has raised up, and a great example even to us. Paul, thanks so much for taking this time with us today to just introduce some of these ideas. I'll just mention again the title of this particular book, Western Christians in Global Mission, What's the Role of the North American Church? Paul, thanks for being with us and for sharing with us in this way.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, friends, we hope that this episode, and in fact this entire second season, has provided you with ideas, practical advice, and resources to help you better engage in the Great Commission. Over the summer, we would love to hear from you. How are you enjoying this podcast, and how are you and your church putting these ideas into action? For links to resources from this episode and all the other episodes, you can visit our website, globalmissionspodcast.com. And as always, we would be very grateful for you to help spread the word about the podcast. Please consider leaving a review in iTunes or Google Play. As this second season winds down, I also want to say a special thanks to Steve and Rebecca and Charlie behind the scenes who helped put all of this together. They're doing a great job. Go team. That's it for today. This Global Missions podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks and throughout the summer when we'll present encore presentations as we continue to explore the grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.